Chris Chelios was never supposed to become a hockey legend. Not the 3 Stanley Cups, not the 3 Norris trophies, not the 1,651 NHL games that still stand as the most by any American-born player in history. His story was never scripted for the Hall of Fame. He was a laid-back kid who spent his teenage years in California, the kind of situation that could have seen him choose surfing over slap shots. And yet, he incredibly managed to carve out an NHL career that stretched nearly 3 decades. This is the wild story of Chris Chelios, from the beach to the Hall of Fame. Let's dive in. His story began humbly in Evergreen Park, Illinois, a suburb just south of Chicago. The Chelios family lived a modest life. Gus, Chris's father, had emigrated from Greece and made his living in the restaurant business, while Susan, his mother, raised the kids in a neighborhood overflowing with children. Winters meant cold walks to the local park, where dozens of kids skated on an outdoor rink that became the hub of their world. Chris first played goalie in boots because he didn't own skates. It was only when his mother stumbled across a $5 pair at Ace Hardware, too big, stuffed with cotton and thick socks, that he found his footing, literally on the ice. Hockey wasn't yet destiny. The family wasn't wealthy, and Gus, who loved hard work above all else, initially saw the sport as a luxury. But his restaurant had become a gathering place for local Blackhawks players in the 1960s, and through them, he occasionally came by tickets. When he took young Chris to a game and Bobby Hull scored a hat trick, everything changed. From that night forward, hockey was no longer just an activity. It was an obsession. By 9 years old, Chelios was playing organized hockey with the Chicago Saints, grinding his way through the ranks of youth hockey. And then, just as his love for the game deepened, everything shifted. The Chelios family uprooted and moved to San Diego. For a teenager who had grown up with frozen ponds, the California sun seemed to erase his chances of ever playing competitively again. At 15, his hockey career nearly ended. There were few rinks, few opportunities, and even fewer reasons to believe this Midwestern kid would ever rise in the sport. But the Chelioses found a way. Gus bought a restaurant near the only rink in town, giving his son access to whatever scraps of ice time were available. Chris adapted, holding on to the game in a place that barely knew it existed. 2 years later, his path took him north to the frigid prairies of Saskatchewan, where he joined the Moose Jaw Canucks, a junior B team in a league where Americans were almost non-existent. The easygoing California teen was suddenly an outsider in a rugged Canadian town, but he thrived. In 2 seasons, he scored 131 points in 108 games, mixing offense with toughness, and racking up nearly 300 penalty minutes. It was the first glimpse of the bruising blue liner he would become. Even then, scouts doubted him. He was small, a late bloomer, and the NHL felt like a distant dream. But he earned a scholarship to the University of Wisconsin, and there, under legendary coach Bob Johnson and assistant Grant Stanbrook, he was transformed. In Madison, he switched permanently to defense and became a star. As a freshman, he recorded 43 assists in 43 games, helping Wisconsin win the WCHA title and reach the NCAA final. A year later, he anchored the blue line as the Badgers won the 1983 NCAA championship, earning all tournament honors. By then, his raw talent had been polished into something undeniable: an elite two-way defenseman, equal parts intelligence and intensity. Chelios also wore the red, white, and blue, captaining the United States at the 1982 World Junior Championship and joining the 1984 Olympic team in Sarajevo. Though the Americans finished a disappointing 7th, it was the beginning of a generational wave. Chelios was part of the group that followed the Miracle on Ice and made American players a permanent force in the NHL. The Montreal Canadiens had already drafted him 40th overall in 1981, but it was after the Olympics that he truly arrived. He joined Montreal late in the 1983-84 season, played in 12 games and added 15 more in the playoffs. By his first full year, he was a Calder Trophy finalist. 2 years later, he hoisted the Stanley Cup. In 1989, he was the best defenseman in the league, winning his first Norris Trophy with 73 points and 185 penalty minutes. For a kid who once skated in boots, it was surreal. But life in Montreal carried enormous pressure. In 1989, when longtime captain Bob Gainey retired, the Canadiens made Chelios a co-captain alongside Guy Carbonneau. He was only 27. A brash American in a French-Canadian market steeped in tradition. He admitted later that he wasn't ready, and the weight of the role affected his play. After injury troubles and a second-round playoff exit in 1990, whispers about his future grew louder. That summer, in a blockbuster trade, he was sent to Chicago for Denis Savard. What could have been a painful exile turned into the fulfillment of a dream. Chelios was going home. His debut for the Blackhawks was the stuff of legend. A goal, an assist, and a fight all in front of a roaring Chicago Stadium crowd. It was the start of a love affair between player and city that defined the early 1990s. Chicago sports were at their peak. Michael Jordan and the Bulls winning titles. The Blackhawks surging to relevance. In 1991, the Hawks captured the President's Trophy as the league's best regular season team. In 1992, they stormed to the Stanley Cup Final, only to fall to Mario Lemieux's Pittsburgh Penguins. Through it all, Chelios was the heartbeat of the team. Fierce, skilled, unrelenting. Off the ice, he became part of the city's fabric. He was close with Jordan and the Bulls, sharing late nights at Chicago hotspots and building friendships that blurred the lines between sports dynasties. On the ice, he was unstoppable, averaging nearly a point per game from the blue line, wearing the captain's C from 1995 to 1999, and cementing his place as one of the greatest defensemen in franchise history. In 9 seasons with the Blackhawks, he scored 487 points in 664 games and added nearly 1,500 penalty minutes. Yet, for all the glory, one thing eluded him: a Stanley Cup in Chicago. The Blackhawks made the playoffs year after year, but never recaptured the magic of the early 1990s. By the late 90s, as the team dismantled around him, Chelios was traded to the rival Detroit Red Wings. The move stung. In his first game back in Chicago, the crowd booed him every time he touched the puck. But if the trade hurt personally, it rejuvenated his career. Detroit was in the middle of its own dynasty, and Chelios became a pillar. He won the Stanley Cup in 2002 and 2008, proving he could still dominate even into his 40s. He logged heavy minutes, matched against the league's best, and became a symbol of longevity and toughness. By the time he retired, he had played 26 NHL seasons, tied with Gordie Howe for most in NHL history, and played more than 1,600 games. His resume glistened. 3 Norris trophies, 11 All-Star selections, 3 Stanley Cups, an Olympic silver medal in 2002, and even the Marc Messier Leadership Award in 2007. Even then, he wasn't finished. He laced up briefly for the AHL's Chicago Wolves in 2009-10 and made a 7-game cameo with the Atlanta Thrashers at the ripe age of 47 years old, before finally calling it a career. From there, he moved into front office roles, serving as a senior advisor and assistant coach in Detroit, before ultimately returning to Chicago as a Blackhawks ambassador in 2018. For Chelios, retirement didn't mean separation. His daughter Kaylee became a broadcaster, extending the family's ties to the game. In 2024, the Blackhawks retired his number 7, raising it to the rafters alongside Stan Mikita, Bobby Hull, and Tony Esposito. It was the final, emotional tribute for the hometown kid who had once skated in boots, who had once nearly lost hockey to the California Sun, and who became one of the game's greatest defensemen. Chris Chelios was never destined to be a Hall of Famer. He wasn't supposed to last 26 seasons. He wasn't supposed to outlast generations of players, and yet he did on his own terms. From a $5 pair of skates to the rafters of the United Center, his story is proof that legends can come from anywhere. And there you have it, the legendary story that led a Chicago kid to the beaches of California and eventually into the Hockey Hall of Fame. So, what's your favorite memory from the legendary career of Chris Chelios? Let us know in the comments. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more videos.